There are people in this room that accepted Jesus before the age of 4. In fact, one of them is our first presenter, Lois. Lois was born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri, the international headquarters of the Church of the Nazarene. She was a third-generation Nazarene on both sides of her family. That's good stock. And her mother and father both worked at the Nazarene Publishing House. So Lois, come on up and share your story.
Thank you, Roy. Well, Sunday school and worship service every Sunday morning. Youth group and evangelical service every Sunday night. Prayer meeting every Wednesday night. Because movies and dancing were forbidden, the teenagers at church usually had their own party every Friday night. Then, when I was 17, I went off to a Christian college. And in addition to the 4 services on Sunday and the 1 on Wednesday, we had chapel every day. And if you didn't want to get kicked out of school, you better never be seen smoking a cigarette or even touching an alcoholic beverage. I was steeped in evangelical fundamentalism from the day I was born. Nevertheless, doubts and skepticism crept in every once in a while. For example, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, my friends would sometimes wonder, could Jonah really live in the belly of a whale for 3 days? Well, most of the kids assumed that, well, God could do anything. Of course he could. Well, I didn't talk about my controversial ideas because I was too shy, but inwardly, I was beginning to hone my mental gymnastics. I was sure that no one could live in the belly of a whale, even for a few minutes, more or less 3 days. So, to put things together, I conceived of an idea that goes something like this. If you were thrown overboard from a fishing boat, you'd be scared. And if you encountered and had an altercation with a giant fish, you'd be terrified. And if somehow you fought your way out and you got to shore, sure would feel like 3 days. My first successful edit of the scriptures. I didn't have to doubt. I could just edit the Bible. And because I never discussed this with anyone else, my ideas were never challenged. There are a lot of contradictions in the scriptures, but I honed my mental gymnastics to a T. It's the things that happen here and now that have the greatest effect on me. For example, when I was about 10 or 11 years old, it really began to bother me when my father would talk about the idea that without God he would be a terrible person. It made me a little angry because I knew that my father would be the same wonderful, caring, compassionate person that he was with or without God. Well, I still believed in God, but I just didn't think he had anything to do with the fact that my father was a wonderful person. When I was a teenager, I knew I should witness, tell my friends about Jesus and tell them that they really needed to be saved. But I couldn't do it because it kind of sounded ridiculous. But some of my church friends did, in fact, bring their school friends to church. And one time when one of these school friends was saved, she joined the church. Well, I was really surprised because inwardly I thought, how could anyone that had not been raised in the church believe something that sounded so absurd? When I realized what I was thinking, I thought, oops. Then I told myself, I'm really glad that I was raised in the church so that I can believe the truth. So I was still a believer. Then as teenagers, sometimes we would talk about the problem of hell. Will the little children in Africa who have never heard the gospel really suffer fire and brimstone in hell for eternity? I couldn't handle that. I reasoned that if God was the loving God that we were taught that he was, just wouldn't let that happen. Surely he would judge every person by the way they lived their own lives. Problem solved. In my late teens, I even began to wonder how our genetics and our environment influenced our thinking and the direction of our lives. got to the point that I wondered if we ever really made a decision of our own. Oops, I really had to stretch it this time. So I even considered the possibility that maybe the only decision we ever really made was a decision as whether or not to accept God and become a Christian. That was a close one, but I was still a believer. By the time I finished high school, science had become my passion. So when I went to college, I majored in physics, and when I went to grad school, I majored in biophysics, and science became my life. To this day, a lot of people still wonder how I could have built my life around science and still be a fundamentalist Christian. They wonder, how can you merge the creation story with evolution? Well, for me, it was easy. Obviously, the creation story in Genesis had to be an analogy. How could any God have explained evolution to Bronze Age people? They just did the best they could. When I was still a Christian, I and others like me considered ourselves theistic evolutionists. That is, evolution was the method by which God created the universe. So this wasn't a problem for me. So when I finished my PhD, I started teaching at a Christian college. After a lifetime of mental gymnastics and suppression of doubts, I was still a believer. In fact, I reinvented hell. I could no longer accept the idea that there was fire and brimstone. So I figured out, well, maybe heaven is just the presence of God and hell is the absence of God. Little did I know that a lot of liberal Christians had already figured this out. What would it take, as Daniel Dennett would say, to break the spell? What would it take to jolt me out of my safe zone? Maybe not comfortable, but safe. Well, anything that would have an impact would have to be about something I sincerely believed. I based all of the edits of the Bible on the concept that God was all-loving and all-powerful, and that I did really believe. Another concept that was emphasized most of my life was God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. That I sincerely believed, and I earnestly searched for God's plan for my life. And that search became the chink in my armor. So there I was, professor at a Christian college, still searching for God's will for my life. And then along came a traditional or a non-traditional student. That's what the college called older students. And this person asked me if I would correspond with a friend of his who was exceptionally intelligent. He just happened to be in prison. Yeah, you can see it coming. Yes. After a period of time of writing to him and visiting said friend in prison, I was sure that it was God's will that I salvage this poor lost soul. Yes, I knew the Bible said, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with an unbeliever." But, between God and I, we were going to salvage him, and he'd become a Christian. And after all, he was exceptionally intelligent and had tremendous potential. So when he was released from prison, he enrolled in the college where I was teaching, and in a few months we were married. Let me tell you, folks, hell is not fire and brimstone. Hell is being married to a sociopathic, alcoholic, ex-convict. The alcoholism had not been apparent because obviously it's not available in prison. And it took several months after he was released before it took his life over again. And I had never heard the word sociopath, but I learned fast. Turns out that sociopathy is a personality disorder, and it even appears to be hardwired into the brain, because signs of it can be seen in fMRIs of the brain. And most psychologists agree that personality disorders cannot be treated. Nevertheless, it took me 4 years to accept the fact that there was no hope. I finally accepted that, and then I realized that if sociopaths cannot be treated, it could not possibly have been God's will for me to marry him. And this led to the idea that there's no such thing as God's will. And it wasn't long before I realized there's no such thing as God. I was done. It was over. All the beliefs or all the doubts I'd ever had were valid. None of it was true, and I was an atheist. So there I was, an atheist, teaching at a Christian college, married to a sociopath. Step one was to get out of the marriage with my life intact. That took a couple of years. Meantime, I didn't dare breathe a word about my lack of belief, or I would have been fired on the spot. You don't teach at a Christian college if you're an atheist. So I had to find a way to support myself so I could quit my job, because living a lie was just killing me. So eventually I saw an ad for a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Calgary. I applied for it, and it was granted, but it took about a year before it actually began. But the time finally came. I quit my job, got out of town, and even left the country. I left my life in Michigan behind and started a new life in Calgary. For the next few years, I concentrated on building a new life. I had a lot of struggles. I had to get rid of some old mental and emotional baggage and search for my true identity. But I was learning and growing. I even met a wonderful guy, and now we have a great relationship. And then eventually I started reading books like God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens and The End of Faith by Sam Harris, and then a couple of deconversion stories. But it was when I read Infidel by Ayaan Hirsi Ali that my life took a new direction. As an ex-Muslim atheist activist, Ayaan's life was in danger, still is. She has bodyguards 24/7. And reading that book, I thought to myself, what am I doing? This woman has her life in danger, but she's speaking, she's writing books. She started a foundation. I should be doing something. I know how fundamentalism affects your life. I've been through the deconversion process. I know the toll that it takes. I should be out there supporting other people that are going through this process that I've been through. So I started searching for atheist organizations. I found far more than I ever imagined there were. But I found my niche when I found what would eventually become ASC, the Atheist Society of Calgary. I became active in the organization, and let me tell you, these atheist heathens are the nicest, most caring, loving, compassionate people I have ever known. And now I can say, at my advanced age, that I'm happier now than I've ever been in my life. When I lost my faith, I found myself.